Great. Welcome back, everyone, to our fourth session. Tonight, we're going to focus on the dignity of work and the rights of workers, focusing on economic justice. This is our fourth of 7 series, so we are over the hump once we get through our time together. I know this is quite a commitment to make time for 7 Thursdays, and I really appreciate your commitment and hope that you're seeing that it's well worth your time. All right, so as we get started here tonight, hopefully this will work all right. Let's see. All right, so here we go. Our overview for this evening. I wanted to start just as we did last time, and as Prenica modeled for us already, to invite you to share any reflections or connections from our conversation last time on family, community, and participation. And then after that, to dive into the dignity of work and the rights of workers, and focus in a particular way on the 1986 pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, written by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and to hear your reactions to this moral vision for an economy that does justice to all people, but especially measured by the most vulnerable members in our society. And then, as I mentioned, we have more principles of Catholic social teaching than we do weeks together. So there are a couple of weeks where we're going to have to do multiple principles together, just like last time we did family, community, and participation all together. So tonight, I want to bring in the principle of liberation, which isn't actually an officially sanctioned principle of Catholic social teaching, but I think you'll see really fits in well with the other principles. And the reason why I want to add it is to advocate that we actually give more attention to the social, the cultural, the political, and economic dimensions of liberation. And I think that will help set up our conversation next week when we look at the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. And then, as always, you're always welcome to share your insights, questions, and I'd like to make ample time for conversation. So for those of you who are on screen, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and add to the chat. And for everyone else, you're also always welcome to raise your hand or add to the chat. And in fact, Maria, I think you raised your hand. Was there something that you wanted to add before we get started?
It's a good thing I'm not at an auction. I didn't really raise my hand.
Okay. All right.
Actually, I was just having a thought about the picture you're displaying, which I thought was particularly apt because it brings together last week's discussion and this week's discussion in St. Joseph.
Yeah, thanks for noticing that. That was intentional.
Yes, I thought it might be.
Great. All right, anyone else with something that they wanted to add? Lois.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about economic justice for all. I remember reading it, I think, close to the time it came out in '86, I suppose. And it really got like very strong reactions depending on, where you stood, I guess, in terms of worker, labor, and capital. I don't know how to, some thought it was ridiculous. So what are the bishops, what are they thinking? Like, you can't run an economy that way, And it struck me that I was thinking about, the guy I mentioned last week, this cousin of mine that is such I characterize a libertarian or something. But so sometimes if I post anything about, wages, minimum wage, how much money people making, and then minimum wage hasn't kept pace. And he always says, like, this is just jealousy. And because someone's rich doesn't make someone else poor and all this kind of stuff. But the thing that he said that then this all put into more clarity for me was something along the lines of people get paid what they're worth. And that's the backward way of understanding this from what we're reading, right? I mean, then the people who went to work in the vineyard at 5 o'clock should get $1, whatever. But you could, and it's John Paul II, and I suppose all the way back to Leo the 13th, but it's not about that. It certainly you have to just, I guess it has to be worth something, but the worth is from the the fact that a person does it, it's worth something because a human person is doing it. And that's very hard for people to, I think they think, what? No, the market tells us what something's worth. And that's a huge, I think people think capitalism, I don't know what they think. Capitalism is out there somewhere. And then all the stuff about God and religion and the faith in the Bible. And that's another thing altogether. They don't work together. One wants to influence the other, but the church shouldn't be trying to influence this kind of stuff, or let God influence it.
Yeah, I think you raised some really important points there, Lois, that there are a lot of people who, like to assign categories of skilled versus unskilled labor. And you'll see there's no such distinction here in the vision of Catholic social teaching. And I think if we're serious about this, there really is no such thing as unskilled labor, or maybe management could be considered unskilled labor, right? People who sit through meetings for a living. But if you think about the people who are picking the food that we eat, there is incredible skill involved in that kind of manual labor. And I think, as we touched on last week, sometimes those generalizations and oversimplifications happen because of the distance that exists between people. We're so far removed from the people who are planting our crops and harvesting them that we don't really understand the human toil that goes into, even thinking about the conditions of the people who make our clothing. For a lot of us, there's slavery stitched right into the fabric of our clothes, but because it's happening in Bangladesh and not in Boston, that it seems so far removed from us that it's easy to just think, well, at least they have a sweatshop job because that's better than nothing. So that's a good setup for tonight. Before we move to anything further related to tonight, any further connections or reflections on our conversation last time about family, community, and participation? Mary Beth.
It's, professors, I missed the last time, but I did take the opportunity to sit and watch the recording. And as I've said, I'm truly the student in the midst, is because I have no background in moral theology. And, I think the spirit moves in my life, because I think the connective tissue that I see here is that the participation in family and the community to the dignity of the worker. I'm reaching up to get a pen right before I'm going on Zoom. And I have a little quote from Gerard Manley Hopkins, and my background is in English, in teaching English, not in theology. And the quote is, "For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces." And I think that somehow defines what the connective tissue is between your story that you told last week about playing with Kevin and then going to visit his father, and the sack of corn, and not realizing yourself what the worth of the work that he was doing was, and his answer to you. And then what we're talking about tonight, and I did read through, these documents, the church documents, to me is, so, weighty with, dogma and doctrine that I'm not familiar with, that obviously is comprehensible. And my thought is, as I'm going through this, is for an average person who obviously has a pretty high literacy rate, this is really, difficult to sift through. I realize most of the people that are on screen with me, at least, have a long familiarity with these documents, so that for your average person to really, integrate this kind of information, it's pretty difficult. So there's a big jump for a lay person to, understand this material and then to integrate it into their life and understand it. So that's my 2 cents on the matter, and I'm open to hear whatever you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an astute observation, Mary Beth, because people lament that Catholic social thought is the church's best kept secret, but maybe it's not really a secret. Maybe it's just inaccessible. And maybe we haven't found the right way to translate these principles so that they're intelligible for people, that they hold weight and are compelling. And I think that that's the task in front of all of us, is to figure out, how do we do the work of translation so that people can not be intimidated by these texts, that they can find them illuminating and encouraging, and that they can really sink their teeth into what's being said. Because, Lois, you stole a little bit of my thunder, in terms of what I've got planned later. Actually, I have 2 comics from when Economic Justice for All was released in 1986 that confirm the point you were making, that the bishops were panned for making these arguments. And every time I see, this kind of criticism, it seems to me that it's more a rejection of an idea, or a characterization, or maybe even better, a mischaracterization of what the bishops are saying. And it's an oversimplification. So Mary Beth, I appreciate that, that there's a chance here for us to kind of think about what's the spirit of what this document is trying to say, and in what way might we try to express this a little bit more poetically, a la Hopkins. I think about the shining, like shook foil that shows us that the grandeur, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. That's a line people will remember. I'm not sure, based on what I asked for all of you to spend time with in the past week, if there's a particular line that you think would be memorable. But I do wonder if there's a way to kind of think about this in a more poetic way that would hit people more in the heart than, try to reach people up here. Thanks, Mary Beth. That's a great start. Maria, was there something you wanted to add?
No.
I think you asked
Oh, I'm sorry.
this way about the connection between last week and this week. I think the most salient point is that if the family is the unit of society, and the place where Christian values are taught, then that family needs to have the financial stability that comes from work. Otherwise, it just can't be a family. So I think those 2 things kind of went together pretty hand in hand. And I agree with you. The language is stultifying. You just read it and you zone out. But however, the one thing I did think, especially reading Lavorma's actions tonight, is that if there's some prescient passages in there, especially in the beginning, that talk about automation and what is going to happen, and the fact that that's going to bring unemployment. And we've arrived at that. And I guess I was sitting here thinking, what they anticipated would happen did happen, and yet nothing happened to stop the stop that cascade of events that has brought about so much economic depression, and as we all know, the rich getting rich and the poor getting poorer. So all of the utopian, for lack of a better word, ideals in there, you've only seen things get really exacerbated and not better. So it makes you wonder, the church can say wonderful things, but when the rubber hits the road, how is it having a positive effect? And I don't see that. So
what a great setup for tonight. Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. I think you're right on the money there, and that's the task. As we'll talk about, especially at the end, thinking through implications and applications of these ideas, that there are a lot of people who are sounding the warning bells right now about what the economy will look like in a post-labor economy because of automation. You think about this already. If you go to the grocery store and you choose to do the self-checkout, essentially, what you're doing free labor, and because you're checking out your own items at the grocery store or at Target or, anywhere for that matter, it's alleviated someone else from being paid to do that job. And, we don't have to debate the ethics of that right now, but to think about if this is only the tip of the iceberg, then where will people find their dignity? Because as hopefully was clear in the passages I highlighted for you for the past week to look at, there is a dignity in work that is separate from salary, like that work is an intrinsic good and an instrumental good, right? Because you can produce something and provide for yourself, but that this is an invitation to be co-creators with God. And if people don't have that opportunity to work and to be a co-creator with God in the world, it really raises the question of how will people imagine themselves as partners of the Holy Spirit if they don't have, a job that's waiting for them. All right, Maria, is this an intentional hand raise this time?
It is. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, I apologize for the inadvertent.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
But I just really appreciated Sister Maria's comment, particularly about workers being displaced or being phased out and not being retrained. And one of the passages in the readings that were recommended for this week touched on how maybe how that could have been avoided if the unions were strengthened in the country rather than being somewhat decapitated or squashed or whatever you would want to say. One of the functions that was pointed out in, I think it was in John Paul's encyclical, was that the unions should be involved in education. And if the unions had not been so weakened, for instance, in this country, the unions could have, might have really served an essential role in retraining workers whose jobs were being eliminated through automation. It's just, a thought. That if the unions had been recognized as a positive force in the labor of this country, perhaps the unions could have been played a vital role in transitioning people from positions that were being eliminated through automation to the new needs that were being created simultaneously.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really practical point, Maria. I was just listening to NPR this week, and they were interviewing workers at a GM plant in Mexico who make $9 a day, which is just about 60 cents over the absolute minimum wage in that country. And the workers were complaining about the fact that they don't get bathroom breaks. They don't get any breaks, not for lunch, not for anything. And so they were talking about how, people are soiling themselves. Menstruating women are staining their pants because there's just absolutely no protection for the workers for these GM plants that were, of course, formerly in the United States, but then outsourced to Mexico because labor is a lot cheaper in Mexico. But the problem wasn't a lack of unions in this case. It was actually that these unions were too cozy with the corporations, and you have these fat cats at the very top who were benefiting from these unjust policies, and the unions had too much power, and that they weren't actually accountable to the workers. So there are a lot of moving parts to this conversation tonight, and hopefully we can avoid getting in the weeds too much. But I really appreciate hearing from a couple of you in terms of what you noticed in the readings, and hope we can continue that. Arlene or John, was there something you wanted to add?
Arlene, you're muted. Arlene, you're muted.
There you go.
What struck me was as I was preparing and doing the readings for today was how different the encyclical was from what we've done in the past, especially like last week. And I thought that last week in addressing and talking about the dignity of the person and the family, we really didn't address the elephant in the room, which is how the family has evolved and changed. And, you know, what do we consider, who's family? What's family? And so those encyclicals really didn't address the present situations we find ourselves in. But yet the encyclical that John Paul II wrote seemed to me to be more in tune with what was happening today. Now, didn't, you know, like, in other words, for me, it seemed more relevant. The other and the past on the family did not seem relevant at all.
Which is fascinating because, you know, Familiaris Consortio comes out in 81. That's the same year that Laborum Exercens comes out, you know, as a 90th anniversary document for Rerum Novarum, and a good setup for where I'd like to head next. You know, just thinking about the ways in which poverty and inequality are offenses against human dignity and peace. This is a passage from Gaudium et Spes. And as you may know, Gaudium et Spes is released in 1965, December 7th, 1965, if I have the date correct. And I know there's a lot of text on this screen, but what I think is really interesting is that, you know, if you look at this middle paragraph, you can see that there are, you know, there's a warning about, you know, at the very time when the development of economic life could mitigate social inequalities, it is often made to embitter them, or in some places, it even results in a decline of the social status of the underprivileged and in contempt for the poor. So that seems to go back to what you were talking about, Lois, with, like, you know, people are paid what they're worth. Well, they're not paid much because they're not worth much. While an immense number of people still lack the absolute necessities of life, some, even in less advanced areas, live in luxury or squander wealth. Extravagance and wretchedness exist side by side. Boy, if there was anything that we could say about 2022, I think it would be that we have extravagance and wretchedness existing side by side. You know, the number of billionaires doubled since the start of the pandemic. You know, you have a select few people who've amassed incredible wealth. Someone like Jeff Bezos is now worth $187 billion, and he wants to go to space. So he builds his own rocket. Does anyone know how much it cost for Jeff Bezos to have about 10 minutes in space?
Top of my head, but
it cost him $5.5 billion. I mean, think about the good that could go toward. And there are a lot of people who think, well, I mean, he's such a philanthropist. Do you know what percentage of Jeff Bezos' net worth he's given away?
Probably zero.
1% of his net worth he's given away, right? So we have not just extravagance and wretchedness existing side by side, but incredible greed. You know, and I mean, I remember the day that Jeff Bezos was launched into Earth, and everyone is, you know, just celebrating this as a feat. Like, look at the good that privatization, or, you know, the private industry can do. But meanwhile, you know, we've had 850,000 people in this country die from COVID, and over 5 million people globally die from COVID. You know, 20,000 children die every day because of inadequate access to clean water, or suitable nutrition, or to preventable diseases like malaria. So it really does raise this moral question of where this inequality is coming from. And so to say, like, boy, that, you know, this is coming out in December of 65, and it's still, you know, to use the word that we got previously, it's prescient, right? While a few enjoy very great power of choice, the majority are deprived of almost all possibility of acting on their own initiative and responsibility, and often subsist in living and working conditions unworthy of the human person. Still true today, even though capitalism has lifted out hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people out of poverty, it's still true that, you know, 1 in 7 people on the planet are living in absolute destitute conditions, unworthy of the human person. So we still have a lot of work to do. So if we take just some time to think about, how we would read the signs of the times today, I think it's worth pointing out that wealth inequality in America persists, that we haven't made as much progress as we might like to think. In 2019, so right before the pandemic started, we saw that the income inequality was at its highest point in the last 50 years. The wealth that we get from the wealth owned by the top 1% of households is $14 trillion, whereas the bottom 50% of households in our country own $0.16 trillion. And if we look at this through a racial lens, we see that the average white family's net worth is about $188,000. And if you compare that to an average Black family's net worth, it's about 13% of that. And this is not, some people would say that, you can chalk this up to just opportunity, but it's not that simple, right? We know that, for example, this is a legacy of slavery. When you had not only people working without any source of income, but without any ability to pass down money through inheritance, without any ability to own property. I mean, when people are able to own their own home and sell it, that's one of the primary ways that people have access to social mobility. And because of redlining, the long legacy of redlining, people of color were not able to buy homes or buy homes in desirable neighborhoods, and to be able to pass down that kind of wealth. And my grandfather went to college on the GI Bill, but the GI Bill was not available to soldiers of color returning from World War II. So though they put their bodies on the line, they weren't afforded that same opportunity so that they could get a college degree free from debt. And then, of course, too, we know that the income inequality, that there's women make 77 cents for every dollar a white man makes, but women of color make under 70 cents for every dollar a white man makes. So those disparities are unfortunately yawning. They keep growing worse and worse. And we saw this in particular in the pandemic, where you can see on the image on the left part of your screen here that that the pandemic was especially hard on communities of color and families of color. The unemployment rate right now is basically for African Americans, it's double the unemployment rate for white Americans. And then at the bottom line, just below the poverty line disparity, I also pointed out that the tax evasion problem, that the United States loses $1 trillion per year because of people evading taxes. I don't know if anyone saw this, but just on Monday of this week, Pope Francis was calling out people who don't pay taxes or don't pay their fair share, and calling on the Italian government in particular to change the tax policy so that individuals or corporations pay their fair share. Someone like Jeff Bezos pays $0 in taxes, even though Amazon is bringing in billions of dollars in revenue. And there's a good, tens of thousands, a good number of Amazon employees who are in public assistance because they don't earn enough to provide for themselves or their families, and we pay the tab. So I just think it's absolutely mind-boggling that our taxes are covering the costs of what it would take for Amazon employees or Walmart employees to be able to have access to healthcare, or to help foot their bills for when they show up to a hospital because they've got a cold or an injury that could have been treated by a doctor if they had health insurance, but they have nowhere else to go but an emergency room. And you and I are shouldering those bills instead of the CEOs who are making, on average, if you took CEO pay and compared it to their average employee, not the lowest paid employee, but their average employee, CEOs are making about 350 times their average employee's annual salary. Lois, was there something you wanted to add here?
Well, I was just going to say, when you point that out about Amazon or some of these big corporations that their workers don't make enough money, they work 28 or 30 hours, they don't get a full-time weekly salary, so that, you know, they don't get the benefits. And then try to tell somebody that, well, look at that, that's corporate welfare. And the fur flies, you know, and they kind of talk about how everyone's free to enter into these agreements. They took the job, they were free to do that. But the church teaches that if, you know, coercion is not freedom, and therefore it's not an honest or a fair deal, you know, if you enter in because you have no other choice.
Right, it's desperation. Yeah. Yeah, I think corporate welfare is an important term there, right? Because, you know, there are certainly a lot of Americans for whom welfare is a dirty word, but we don't think about the ways that we're subsidizing corporations and CEOs so that they can, you know, deliver on huge profits to their stockholders at the expense of people who, you know, as you say, are facing desperation and don't have any alternative. And I think, you know, to be honest, going back to what Sister Maria mentioned with automation, you know, the gig economy, and with so many people now becoming contractors instead of employees, there are more and more people who are facing contingent status and who are vulnerable because they don't work full time, they don't have salary and benefits. You know, they're working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet, but because they're not a full-time employee at any one of those places, they still don't get anything like paid time off or family leave or paid childcare or health insurance. Arlene and John, was there something you wanted to add?
Well, the saddest reality is, in terms of tax evasion, there is a group of folks in Congress who have systemically and systematically made sure that when they do the federal budget, they have diminished the size of IRS so that there are less people around to go out there and check on all the millionaires and all the ways they're beating taxes.
Yeah, that's an important point, John, because white collar crime faces almost zero enforcement. And if you compare white collar crime and that kind of, I mean, look at $1 trillion being lost and compare that to the kind of enforcement that's happening for, you know, things like drugs in the inner city, where, you know, there are people sitting behind bars facing life in prison for a small amount of drugs. You know, we don't treat substance abuse very well in this country, and then meanwhile you have, you know, billions of dollars or millions of dollars getting pushed offshore to untraceable accounts, and there's zero enforcement of that. Cecilia.
I was just going to talk about sugar. When you put sugar in your coffee or in your tea, do you realize in the Dominican Republic, which is big, huge sugar plantations, the workers make $1 a day? And why are they working? Because there's 50,000 behind them that will take their job. It's slave labor.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember vividly visiting a Chiquita banana plantation in Nicaragua and seeing 5, 6, 7-year-old children, not just climbing banana trees to pick bananas, but who lost limbs, you know, because they fell out of those trees, and there was absolutely no provision for these children. You know, they were totally vulnerable to exploitation. And as you say, Cecilia, there were other children who were lining up to take these jobs because it was at least some money to provide for their families. But to think about, you know, every time I see a Chiquita banana, all I can think about are those teeny tiny little kids who are risking life and limb to climb up a tree to harvest those bananas. So I can go to Trader Joe's and pay 29 cents for a banana. Yeah. All right. So here's that article from Pope Francis: Taxation should favor wealth redistribution. All right, so one of the readings that I asked you to take a look at, and I know Lois and a couple others have already referenced it, in addition to Matthew 6, where Jesus says we can't serve God and mammon, and a good translation of mammon would be money. You know, it was this passage, which I said last week, very often gets spiritualized, and people make this about, you know, someone's relationship with God, and if they discover faith later in life, they'll be warmly welcomed, which is not at all what Jesus is saying here, which I think is pretty maddening, that we would we would really take out the teeth of this passage and what it's trying to say. So I wanted to open this up for some conversation. What did you notice when you spent time with this passage and thinking about the landowner who goes out looking for laborers at dawn and at 9 and at noon and at 3 and even at 5 o'clock? Did you think about who were those people who were still, they're not sitting on their couch eating bonbons, waiting for a check to come from the government. They're sitting out in the public square from dawn to dusk, desperately hoping that someone will put them to work. Did any of you think about what that would be like? Because when I sit with this passage, all I can think about is the incredible shame that would come from having to sit out there waiting for someone to put me to work so that I could provide for my family. Maria?
My thought was actually somewhat similar to what you just stated. And in part, it was triggered actually by a homily several years ago, but really stuck with me because, again, I think when I was younger reading this passage, it just struck me as unfair. I saw myself as the one getting there at sunrise, working till sunset, and then being paid the same as someone who worked for an hour. And that's unfortunately the way I saw it. And then I had heard a very good homily, which touched exactly or very similarly to what you were saying, that the people who showed up for work and weren't hired until later in the day were in likelihood experiencing a high level of anxiety, that they were not going to be hired, that they were not going to have the resource, the money to bring home to their family to support them. And once I heard that homily, my take on this reading completely spun into a different direction, very good direction. And that's now when I read it, that's what I think of is the anxiety. And as you said, also maybe the embarrassment of not being hired early in the process or at all. But as I said, it's really the fact that the people who remained, and they did remain, they didn't go home, they didn't, decide to sit even just to spend the day sitting in the shade. They stayed out in the sun, waiting and hoping to be hired. And then the other thing that struck me when I read this now, having read, and I think it was again, Pope John Paul's encyclical about the subjective nature of work, that, again, these are individuals who wanted to contribute, who wanted to, validate themselves, you might say, by performing the work they were trained to perform, and being denied that for whatever reason, even if it's just happenstance, is diminishing, in a sense, even dehumanizing. That was just my thoughts in reading.
Absolutely. Yeah, so well said. Thank you, Maria. Mary Alice. Oh, you're muted.
I was thinking of a particular place out in Southampton where, given the time of day, you will see people waiting to be hired. And their wait is itself part of their ability to work. They're there. They want to work. And so the whole idea of the dignity of the person who can put themselves in that position of sitting and waiting all day. And so I guess I was moved to think of how wonderful it would be if we could have people who could employ individuals, no matter when they come onto the scene, but to look at them as valuable individuals who are there to somehow contribute to the whole. And certainly the whole idea of the dignity of work is crying out there for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Cecilia?
When I pray over or think about it or dwell on it. It's God gives us what we need. And that's what not what we want, but the point is there is enough for everyone. And so it's very, very inclusive. And so I think when we think of community, it's not pitting people against one another, and that we're all in this together and building a relationship with one another. And we have to help one another. And it isn't somebody getting up to the top. It's all of us together. And that's what I call the body of Christ.
Amen. Mary Beth.
Following up what Mary Alice was talking about, the day laborers, I happened to have just gone to MoMA yesterday, and I actually went to a photography exhibit by a black and white photographer by the name of Robert McNeil, who has a series called Bronx Slave Market. And that's exactly what he photographed, was African-American women who were mainly West Indian immigrants to New York City. And they would line up on the streets in the Bronx waiting for Westchester housewives, mainly, that were hiring them as domestic workers. And many of the photographs were these very well-dressed white women negotiating essentially what they said, because it was dated like 15 cents an hour when they were asking 20 cents. And you could see that they were well-dressed women. Many of them were living with other relatives because there was a narrative that was included. And it was about the dignity of these people. And they're waiting, they were sitting on benches on the side of drugstores. And you could see it was an all day kind of thing. And it was, the photographs really were a testament to what they had to endure in terms of their human dignity. It wasn't just the price or the hourly rate that they were asking. It really had to do with that aspect of the human dignity of the worker. And I really suggest that you look it up online, because it really was a photograph says volumes many times. So a very good piece of work that he did.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Mary Beth. Prinika.
Yes, so my best friend's sister, she used to work in a garment factory in Sri Lanka. And when they have to close the line, they have to work until like 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, go to work at 6 o'clock. And she's unmarried at that time. So her mother has to go and pick her up from the bus because it's dark time. And that time the Civil War was going on. So she has to be accompanied by somebody. She just cannot come home by herself. And they didn't get any benefits. No medical benefits or anything. If they are sick, okay, you don't go to work, you don't get paid. And then when I come here, I see in Macy's, they're selling those clothes. They're very expensive. And then after the season is over, they put it half price, 80% off, 60% off. And these clothes were treated as like, nothing after a few months, because they made their money by selling maybe quarter of those clothes already. To think that they can do that not to pay over there, it's used to make me so angry, at the same time very sad, how much they put work and hear how it's been treated.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was thinking of, before, I heard in a couple of homilies that priest saying that God is a prodigal God, in a sense, like our God is very lavished. He is not stingy in love. So
Right.
it's given freely and more than enough we have. But when it's come to human, we want to grab everything. So we treat others as nothing because we want to hold on and quote everything.
Yeah, well said, which is, I think, absolutely the spirit here, in Matthew 20, where the landowner says, Are you envious because I am generous? Right? That the landowner is willing to pay a day's wage for someone who only works an hour. It can seem unfair, as Maria said earlier. It doesn't seem right that someone who works all day gets paid the same amount as someone who only works an hour. But if you think about this story, if you try to imagine the scene, you can, I think, begin to visualize who were those people hired at dawn. They're probably the big burly men, the one where the landowner could get the most bang for his buck by hiring the biggest and the strongest who are going to pick the most grapes. And then, at 9, he gets the second stringers in there, maybe the teenage boys, or maybe there are a few women who are a little bit stronger, right? But when you get to the noon and the 3 and then the 5 o'clock, right, those have to be the feeble and the weak, the injured, the very old or the very young, who are only out there out of desperation. They're out there in the marketplace desperately seeking that they can have an opportunity to provide for their family. And so the gratuity of God's love is absolutely spot on. You're right, Sister Prinika, that's, I think, an important focal point for us to hang on to. And yet, there's also a partiality here. There's a preference to make sure that those who are often overlooked, the ones who are treated as insignificant, nobody's problem, just the discardable people, the part of the throwaway culture that Pope Francis has been lamenting throughout the almost 9 years of his pontificate, that those are the ones that God wants to make absolutely sure have an opportunity to not only contribute, but then to have enough to be able to live on. Because, in this economy, most people were day laborers. Most people aren't landowners. There are a lot of people who don't have a skill that they can do a particular craft and make something, or have the supplies to keep making things. And so when you would be put to work, if you worked a day, you would get paid enough so that you could probably live for 2 weeks on that wage. And so for someone to work just an hour, especially if they were weak or sick or injured, it probably was incredibly taxing for them. But to have that opportunity to be able to know, all right, I have enough to survive for the next 2 weeks. Imagine the relief that comes at the very end, after all the shame they endured just sitting out there in the marketplace, thinking it's probably not going to happen for me today. Kathleen, you have your hand up. What would you like to add?
I deal with a number of undocumented people out here on Long Island, and we see these shape up places every day when you drive down the street and in the neighborhoods. Concerns about the employer not paying what they originally promised.
Right.
And it really is an issue. So they expect to make, let's say, $50 or whatever, and they might come home with 30. And there's always an argument or a fight. And I've had to make some phone calls for some of these people, and you get absolutely nowhere. And then you have to start working. You don't know whether you should be complaining, because then they'll never get a job.
Right.
And it's a vicious circle.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, especially in the undocumented community, because employers know that they're so vulnerable. If the undocumented get reported, they will get deported.
Right.
And not only the wage theft that happens for undocumented workers, but the physical and sexual abuse that is, they're preyed upon. It's just absolutely horrible. And the kind of extortion that happens from people who are collecting their rent. These really are harrowing stories. But in the media,
Yes.
The narrative is these people are coming to take our jobs, which of course, is factually untrue in most cases, because there aren't Americans who are lining up for these jobs, given the very low wages and very tough conditions. I have to say for myself, I grew up in the suburbs of Milwaukee in a fair amount of privilege. My parents are working class. blue collar. I mean, my mom was a nurse who just worked enough so that we would have health insurance, and my dad was an appliance repairman, but he was self-employed, so he set the terms for how often he worked and what prices he charged. And we didn't have a lot, but we always had enough. And I kind of just presumed that everyone around me also had at least enough or more than enough. And that even though there's some job insecurity that comes when you're self-employed, that because my dad had been an entrepreneur for so long and was such a good worker and a hard worker, that he had the kind of reputation where he had more work than he could actually do, because of all the customers who were calling for him to fix their appliances. And I really didn't have a lot of exposure to the precariousness that so many people have until I was in college. I studied at Marquette University, which, if you've ever been to Milwaukee, is an urban campus. I got panhandled almost every day walking to class, walking over a freeway overpass, and getting to know people who were unhoused on a daily basis. And because I was a product of Jesuit education and was trained from the age of 14 to be a man for others, I spent a lot of time doing service. And one of the places where I'd served the most was a meal program called St. Ben's, which is on 9th and State in downtown Milwaukee. And I would go there every Friday to serve a meal. And, it was always way more enjoyable to stand behind the line of food and to divvy out the mashed potatoes or the lasagna or whatever, and to get the thank yous, because it was a nice warm fuzzy, look at me, I'm such a good person, providing people with a hot meal. But after a while, the people who ran St. Ben's, actually, they asked me to go and sit with the guests and just to visit with them, which was really uncomfortable as an 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid, because I had no idea what we were going to talk about. What could I possibly have in common with these people? And that's how I saw it. These people, they were them. They were people that I couldn't relate to, or that people I could feel sorry for, but not see myself in their shoes. And it was really moving, to try to sit there and to ask about their day. And some people warmed right up to me and were happy to have a conversation partner. There were plenty of people who wanted nothing to do with me. They wanted their warm meal. They didn't want to have to explain their life story. They were dealing with their own demons, and they didn't want to make time for me and my curiosity, which probably looked a little bit more like voyeurism. And there are a lot of stories, from the years of doing that service at St. Ben's that I could recount, but one in particular has always stayed with me because I got to know a man named Robert who wore every single item of clothing that he owned every day, no matter if it was 10 degrees outside or 100 degrees outside. He always wore every item of clothing that he owned. And on top, he had this big trench coat that he was always wearing. Didn't matter the weather. He had that on top. And I got to know Robert pretty well over the course of my time at St. Ben's. And over time, I learned more and more of his story, which included learning that Robert had actually been a professor at Marquette. And he got very sick. And because he got very sick, he couldn't complete all of the requirements for tenure. And when he went up for tenure, he was denied tenure. And I didn't know this as a college student, but when you're denied tenure, it's not like, well, you just don't get, to come back next year. It's, you don't get a job. You are pushed out of the academy, and no one wants to hire you if you do not get tenured. So he lost his job. And because he lost his job, he had no health care and benefits. He really started to struggle with his mental health in addition to his physical health. His marriage dissolved. He lost his home. And eventually he was living on the streets of Milwaukee. And I mean, it was a kind of an earth-shattering moment for me to see that, a couple of years earlier, Robert could have been one of my professors. He could have been someone who was giving me grades and reading my work. And now, because of his health, something that he couldn't control, because of, his genes that gave him this chronic illness, he was now living on the streets without any way to provide for himself, having lost his marriage and the time to be able to spend with his children, and living basically a nightmare, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that kind of precariousness, the kind of the powerlessness of the poor, I think really shows the way that our economy doesn't show equal regard, that we kind of put everything in terms of work ethic or opportunity and presume that everyone has equal opportunity. When in fact, I think stories like Robert show us that there are a lot of people living on the edge, and it can come down to luck, that some people are blessed with good luck or good health, or who come from a family with a lot of financial security, so that, if even Robert, maybe if he didn't get tenure, maybe there was an aunt or an uncle who could loan him the money, so that he could, stay on his feet or not miss paying rent or whatever it would be. And so I think that that's part of what's going on here with this story in Matthew 20, is that vulnerability, that precariousness, that those are the needs that we have to be attentive to. And when the bishops are writing, when the popes are writing about the economy, it's really, this invitation to think about how do we measure, who is served by the economy, and can we say that the economy is good for anything other than the accumulation of incredible wealth for a select few? So, there were a couple passages that I asked you to take a look at in anticipation of our conversation tonight. And here are just a couple highlights so that, we're just all operating on the same page. But I think, what's worth paying attention to here is that, this is a tradition that spans 130 years. So the quote at the very top of your screen comes from Rerum Novarum, that was published in 1891, calling for the dignity of work and the rights of workers. And then, in the document that some of you read, Laborum Exercens, which was published on the 90th anniversary of that document, again, we see Pope John Paul II reaffirm that work is a way that we are co-creators with God, that we're partners with the Holy Spirit in the unfolding reign of God, and that this benefits individuals, it benefits families, and it's a way to contribute to society as part of the divine plan, that we were made for work. Not that work is the only thing that matters, but it is part of what it means to be human, that we were given these skills and this knowledge, and that this is part of the process of humanization, to see what we can produce and what difference that can make. And I think it's important too to highlight the rights involved. So in 1967, this document, Popularum Progressio, is released by Pope Paul VI, where he highlights, that there are rights like, the right to private initiative, that people should be able to decide their own work. And I think of like an Etsy shop, where if someone really likes a particular craft, that's actually a right, not just a nicety, but that people have a right to be able to say, I really enjoy this, I'm passionate about it, I want to explore it, and that I want to take the initiative to be able to provide for my family. The right to have access to material goods necessary for living, to own property, that's actually a right to own property, it's not just reserved for a select few, and to fully participate in the economic sector. So as Sister Maria was saying earlier, you can see that family and participation really do connect to the dignity of work and the rights of workers, because this is not only how people provide for their families, but how they participate in society as agents of their own future and as contributing to the common good. And I think it's important here, with the pontificate of Pope Paul VI, we started to see this emphasis on integral human development, that this is something that is a way for human advancement, not just in technology or for profit, but for becoming more fully human. And Pope Paul VI highlights these three major duties: mutual solidarity, social justice, and universal charity. And I think that's really important in light of what Lois said, earlier about libertarians who see, kind of a I do me, you do you framework, or kind of a laissez-faire approach. You stay in your lane, I'll stay in mine, don't tread on me, that kind of thinking, where we just want the government to get out of the way. That this isn't about class warfare. It's not about an attack on the rich, and it's not trying to pit, the masses against the elites, and kind of, you think of the Communist Manifesto and Karl Marx saying workers of the world unite. This is really a vision for cooperation and for partnership. Sis Maria, I see you have your hand raised. You're muted.
Yeah, it was about the second paragraph, I mean, when I read that, I was thinking today, about their labor as unfolding the creator's work. And, I was imagining the person who's flipping hamburgers in McDonald's and all greased up every night, the person washing dishes. I mean, there's something about that paragraph that I found annoying. And I thought, I wonder if you were flipping hamburgers, were you going to read that and say, are you kidding me? Are you just kidding me that I am unfolding the creator's work? Or if you're running like a rat in a wheel in Amazon, which also I think similar to the situation that you mentioned, doesn't have time for bathroom breaks and stuff. I mean, I think that when work doesn't even give a human being a window, a horizon, to think about who you are as a person and to experience God when you're in a rat race. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I find what the church says incredibly utopian, and it doesn't really reach people where they are at. And I was thinking that should be a best kept secret of Catholic social teaching, because I think a lot of people who have low paying $6, $7 an hour jobs are probably going to look at that and say, I don't think that. Again, there might be some people who have incredible sense of the contribution they make to society, even window washers. But I wonder, for the majority of poorly paid people who work for the Amazons of this world, if they ever get to look above and see what they're doing in any kind of positive context.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there, Maria, and I appreciate you playing devil's advocate a little bit.
Yeah,
And I think you're pointing to at least two things here. You're pointing to the ways in which, when people aren't given a just wage, it's really hard for anyone to recognize the dignity of that labor, right? Like, people can be dehumanized because they're making such little wages, right? And to think that they are unimportant. But I think alternatively, part of the social critique here is to say we do need people who are flipping burgers, right? Like, we need people who are going to feed other people, or who only can afford, unfortunately, to eat off the dollar menu at McDonald's. I mean, it's not a healthy way to live, but it's a cheap way to feed a family, or to get a quick meal. And we need people who do that work. Just as when I was 5 years old, I really wanted, more than anything, I wanted to be a trash collector. And I would help the garbage men on my street in Milwaukee. And they would give me seashells as a way of saying thank you. But they would also say, the older I got, they would say, kid, stay in school. You don't want to be a trash collector. I mean, it's a stinky job, right? And I can't imagine being at a party, with my wife's coworkers, and they ask me what I do. And I say, what, I'm a waste technician, or, that doesn't, there's not a lot of social status assigned to being, a trash collector. But can you imagine a world without trash collectors? I mean, it would be chaos. It would, it'd be horrible. And so I think, that's part of this vision of cooperation and partnership, is to see, that we do need each other, that I always think of that passage in the first letter of Corinthians, chapter 12, where Paul talks about us as many members of one body, and that the eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you, or the ear can't say to the foot, you're expendable. But I think the task in front of us is to create an economy where we actually do value these roles and the interdependence that they speak to, because whether they're window washers or custodians, whatever the job, whatever the menial task might be, these are jobs that make life better for everyone else. And I think people are invited to look for the ways that not only are they invited to kind of make a difference through their work, but also the ways that we are beneficiaries of the work that other people are doing all the time, even though a lot of that work is invisible or unrecognized or not appreciated. And a lot of it is unpaid, right? Like we don't pay for caring for children. You know, think about all the free labor that goes into raising children, all the, I hate to say this phrase because it's so patronizing, but stay-at-home moms, or, you know, people who stay home to rear their children. That's not paid work, but boy, is it valuable, right? Like to be a secure and stable and loving presence for children. The fact that our economy doesn't value that work by putting a salary to it, I think is lamentable, but it shouldn't mean that it's unimportant. All right, we have a bunch of hands, and we're at 8:35. We're down to our last 10 minutes, so we'll hopefully hopefully here. All right, Cecilia, then Arlene, then Mary Beth, then Kathleen, and then Mary Alice.
I thought I would give you the other side on human work, the encyclical Laborum. The Pope writes, however, it is also a fact that in some instances, technology can cease to be man's ally and become almost his enemy, as when maximization of work supplants him, taking away all personal satisfaction and the incentive to creativity and responsibility, when it deprives many workers of their previous employment, or when through exalting the machine, it reduces man to the state of slave. Right on.
That's
Pope.
prophetic. Yeah, that's prophetic. Thank you. Arlene and John.
In light of everything we've just been saying, and sister, you're really on the mark. Let's go to the last line of that parable. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Is there not a paradigm shift here? No matter what your position, your value is not in your position, whether it be first or last, but your value is in the fact that you are part of this whole incarnation event, part of this whole. We talk about automation, what's going on. We have to go into a real paradigm shift about that whole situation, because the fact is there will not be enough manual or physical labor available. There has to be some way that we still have value. That's the whole paradigm shift. And I think Jesus invited us to that paradigm shift right up front there. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. Your position makes nothing about who you are and what your value is.
Yeah, well said. Thanks, John. Mary Beth.
I'm going to make all these references to Catholic doctrine. Yesterday's New York Times had an op-ed by Tara Westover, the author of the book Educated, if you've read that book. And
that
it
book's
was
a trip.
exactly speaking to this issue. She spoke about her life as a student at Brigham Young University, where she did all kinds of manual labor to the next job. She wants to work 3 different jobs to be able to support herself as a student. And that the whole factor that I believe they do speak about this in is the work and self-realization and the value of that. And however, then she segued to the fact that, people today, what you were saying about not even getting a bathroom break. And so that eliminates the value of self-expression and self-realization that is supposed to be attached to the dignity of work. Excellent, excellent op-ed. So it was in yesterday's Times, just making everybody aware.
Thanks, Mary Beth. All right, Kathleen.
I find it interesting that during COVID, with the shortage of workers, it's forcing higher wages because employers are desperate for people. And I'm just wondering if this will begin to lift all boats, and if so, will the higher wages be maintained? Social situation.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, we're seeing higher wages in some sectors, but not all sectors.
Not all.
And there are a lot of people who, this is the great resignation. There are a lot of people who are just walking away from the work because whatever the wage, even if it's increased, it's still not worth the mental and emotional toll, or they have dependents that they need to take care of, whether they're children or elderly parents, or someone else, maybe a sick spouse. So I think we can all agree we are living in an economy that works for everybody, and that's what I appreciate so much about the USCCB's document, Economic Justice for All, because it's really trying to bring a moral vision to the economy and think about the ways in which the economy should serve human life, not vice versa. Mary Alice.
Yes, and in keeping with that, I thought in both of the readings, what came out was the idea that the community is very important in this whole question of one's work. So Maria, with the flipping of the hamburgers, when someone who is running a business has a way of making people feel that they are part of something important. No matter what they are doing, they are part of something important. I agree that the wages are not where they should be, but we do need people who flip hamburgers. And I think that's really crucial, and it comes out over and over again, that we're not alone. We do all that we do in community.
Yeah, thanks. Well said. Okay, so hopefully you had some time with this document, Economic Justice for All, and I'm sorry we're going to be a little bit rushed here till the very end. The trick here that Sister Maria asked me to do Catholic social teaching in 7 75-minute sessions. This is challenging for me. Like, I took an entire graduate course on economic justice. So to try to take 15 weeks and boil it down to 75 minutes, I'm doing the best that I can, but I am sorry that we're going to have to move pretty swiftly here. So as you may have seen, when you had time with this document, the goal, the bishop said, was to strengthen a common moral vision so the economy serves people more fairly through love and solidarity, justice and participation, overcoming marginalization and powerlessness. And I think it's really helpful in those paragraphs on justice and participation that the bishops describe justice, not as vengeance, not as, a government treating everyone exactly the same, but as commutative. So right relationships between people, fair dealings, but between individuals, as distributive, making sure that people have enough resources and opportunity, that's being distributed evenly across society. And then the contributive dimension, that people have an opportunity to contribute to society that is empowering. And I think, if we were going to write this document today, we would add restorative justice. So how do we make amends, or how do we redress harm for all the ways people have been socially disadvantaged throughout our history's country? So thinking, for example, of reparations for those who've been mistreated, whether because of slavery or the Jim Crow South, or just the gender inequality and the wage gap between women and men. I think a restorative justice framework would be really helpful in enhancing this document. The bishops talk about the dignity of work, a self-expression that goes to the self-realization that Mary Beth was just sharing, that Tara Westover was highlighting, that this is the way that we express who we are, what we're good at, what we can share, and what we're passionate about. Certainly that's how I feel as a college professor. There is nothing else I'd rather be doing, and nowhere else I'd rather be. If I were flipping burgers, it would be awfully frustrating, but it also makes me very grateful that there are people that are doing that. And I hope that they can do it in a way that makes them feel like an artisan, so that they're flipping really delicious burgers and not just shoveling food down people's throats. I think it's important, to point out that people have a right to employment, that this isn't just reserved for a select few, that people should have a way to provide and to contribute, to earn a fair wage, to earn benefits, and to form unions. And I think this quote in the very middle, I think, is really the heart of the document. The way society responds to the needs of the poor through its public policies is the litmus test for its justice or injustice. And I think that's really everything that the bishop's trying to say, that we are operating in an economy that is designed to benefit. This isn't a broken system or flaws in a system. This is a system working exactly as it was intended to benefit those who already have capital, so that they can they can maximize their return on investment. They invoke the principle of solidarity and subsidiarity, taking action at the lowest effective level. And that principle of subsidiarity this isn't about totalitarianism or trying to impose a government-run economy. And we'll talk more about solidarity and subsidiarity at the very end of our time together. And we've already talked about this call for cooperation and partnership and a just and rational coordination of economic actors. And I think here's the connection to this principle of liberation so that people can be agents of their own future. That's really what the bishops are calling for, that people have some say in their destiny and that they are economic agents, not out of desperation, but to exercise free choice. Cecilia and Mary Beth, was there something from this document you wanted to address? Mary Beth, you're muted.
No, I meant to lower my hand from before. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Okay. So as Lois mentioned, when this document came out, the bishops were torched. Here are just two comics that I saved. One of my professors at Boston College was David Hollenbach, who actually did a good amount of work ghostwriting this document for the bishops and in consideration with other lay advisors, economists. Father Brian Hare, who teaches at Harvard, was one of the principal authors as well. And the bishops got a lot of flack for speaking out of their depth, and we see this even now with Pope Francis. When Laudato Si came out and he was talking about the environment, there were so many people who said, the Pope should stick to religious matters or moral matters and keep his nose out of economics or the environment. And so I think, my hypothesis is that this kind of backlash, and not just from secular media, but even from conservative Catholics, Michael Nowak really took the bishops to task. There are a good number of very conservative Catholics who operate with that libertarian framework that Lois mentioned, where they thought, that this is Marxist, or, the bishops are calling for a government takeover or to encroach on, small businesses or free market economy. And so there was a lot of pushback against the bishops. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why we really haven't seen the bishops even mark the anniversary of this document. It came out in 1986. There really was no acknowledgement of it that I can recall in 96 or in 2001 or 2006 or 2011 or 2016 or 2021. Typically these anniversaries are opportunities for the bishops to say, hey, remember when we said this? And this is a document, along, I think, with the Challenge of Peace, the pastoral letter that came out in '83, that has been kind of left in the shadows, unfortunately. And I think it's a shame that the bishops maybe didn't have thicker skin to be able to say, no, we know this is grounded in scripture and tradition, as you read in the document, right? Like they give us the biblical basis and the overview from Catholic social teaching to kind of show this is why we're saying what we're saying. And I think this is part of this call to the principle of liberation, a word that doesn't appear in too many documents in the canon of Catholic social teaching, but here are three places that I think are helping to show the purchase of this principle of liberation. The first coming from Solicitudo Rei Socialis, an encyclical by Pope John Paul II that came out in 1987. We'll focus on this a little bit more when we get to the principle of solidarity. But you can see that, here's John Paul II talking about the process of development and liberation takes concrete shape in the exercise of solidarity, that is to say, in the love and service of the neighbor, especially of the poorest. For where truth and love are missing, the process of liberation results in the death of a freedom which will have lost all support. In the context of sad experiences of recent years and of the mainly negative picture of the present moment, the Church must strongly affirm the possibility of overcoming the obstacles which, by excess or defect, stand in the way of development. And she must affirm her confidence in a true liberation. And that's not just in the end times, the reign of God or, eternal life. That is the work that we're trying to do now to build up the reign of God on earth. And even Pope Benedict XVI, who was probably more right of center than then Pope Francis, I think we can safely say, he pointed out in Deus Caritas Est, his 2005 encyclical, within the community of believers, there can never be room for a poverty that denies anyone what is needed for a dignified life. So I think an important point here that charity or philanthropy are simply not enough given the scale of need that exists in our communities and across the globe. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis talks about the need for us to work for those, especially the poor men and women who will have been liberated once and for all, if we deliver on the demands of justice. So, just to illustrate what we're talking about here, this does not mean treating everyone exactly the same. And it doesn't even mean that kind of the equity that's a big buzzword right now, where you give the greatest advantage to the one in greatest need. But it really does mean trying to make room for taking down the barriers, in the example of this image, taking down the barriers that keep people from participating, given whatever their position in life might be. I do have a small problem with this image because it shows that the person in greatest need is short, like it's their problem because they're short, that's why they're at a disadvantage. I think this image would actually be better if it showed three people of equal height, but the ground being at a slope, that some people are given a disadvantage rather than feeding into kind of this stereotype that we should feel sad for these poor little ones who really can't help themselves. Okay, trying to get to the practical dimension here. Some paths, I think we've kind of danced around this a little bit, but I think it would be helpful just to make this explicit. So what are we talking about here? Well, I think combating a culture that has normalized greed, reforming the tax code so that individuals and corporations pay their fair share, especially in providing for the most vulnerable. Ensuring access to affordable quality healthcare and policies that ensure adequate paid time off, sick and family leave, as well as savings for retirement. Enhancing worker protections against exploitation and risks to safety or well-being. Protecting the right to unionize. I'm from Wisconsin, and the Republican governor there passed legislation he called it like the right to work legislation that made it sound like it was pro-worker, but was actually anti-union. That's been pretty prominent recently. We certainly need to increase the minimum wage that, as I've mentioned before, hasn't been increased since 2009, the longest span of time without seeing a cost of living adjustment. And people who are making a minimum wage now are actually behind what people were making at the minimum wage in the 1960s. Advancing legislation for a universal basic income so that people don't have to live in squalor if they're disabled or if they're unable to work. And I think making ethical purchases, there's this website called the Better World Shopper's Guide, and there's actually a book that you can buy where you can look up corporations and see how they're rated based on the way they treat their workers, the way they, try to ensure a transparent supply chain, the way they care for creation. It's really fascinating to see some of the worst offenders against human rights and ecological protection, and also to be able to support companies that are really socially responsible and environmentally responsible. Although I would want to caution, I think it's a little bit dangerous that a lot of people are kind of sold on this idea that the answer to these problems means to buy our way to justice, through more consumerism, like their fair trade coffee and chocolate sales outside of churches. And then I think sometimes that's just to make people feel good, like, oh, I paid a fair wage or, for this coffee or this chocolate, but that's not nearly enough, to, in terms of the scale of the need. So we can't buy our way out of this. And then I think finally, to combat sweatshop labor and human trafficking, this map on the right is actually a map of hotspots for human trafficking in our country, which I think is pretty eye-opening. I went to a talk when I was in graduate school in Boston where the scholar who was specializing in human trafficking pointed out that there were about 30,000 slaves living in Boston at the time. This is probably about 10 years ago now. I had no idea that slavery was still part of the fabric of our society. But most of these people are undocumented immigrants, people who are working as domestic workers, working in factories, and the vast majority is sex trafficking, where women and children are being trafficked, and including for the porn industry. There's a lot of work to do, and I really appreciate there's this organization called U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. If you Google that group, you'll see a lot of great resources to try to combat the kind of human trafficking that exists. We're unfortunately out of time for our conversation, but it was great to hear from a lot of you. If you're interested in further study, I noticed some of you have taken pictures of these slides, so I wanted to make sure I was giving you some good resources here. I think a classic text is John Kavanaugh's Following Christ in the Consumer Society. Talk about prescient. I mean, that came out, I think, in '81. And boy, I mean, it looks like it was written yesterday. There was a '91 edition and I think a 2001 or 2006 edition. So it's been updated a little bit. So this cover comes from the third edition. But boy, John Kavanaugh was a Jesuit philosopher who taught at SLU for many years, and his diagnosis of a consumer society that depersonalizes and dehumanizes, that commodifies people and our work is just so spot on. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about the document Economic Justice for All and how Catholic theologians weigh in on it, this is a good edited volume on it by Mark Allman, The Almighty and the Dollar. And then the other three books are books that came out very recently through Georgetown University Press. They're a little bit more dense, but they really are excellent in terms of trying to take a constructive approach to what we can and should do about all this economic exclusion and exploitation, including this book, Cathonomics, that just came out, I think, about a month ago. And I think someone had read an article in Commonweal by Tony Annette, where he was trying to put forward this idea for trying to put Catholic social teaching in action. All right, so for next time, we're going to focus on the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. And there isn't a lot of material on this principle in the canon of Catholic social teaching. So I just have a couple paragraphs for you to pay attention to from two encyclicals. But if you have time, I think, spending time with the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 would be worthwhile. So, spending time with Matthew 25, the judgment of nations passage, I'm sure it's familiar to you already, but spending time with it, thinking about this biblical witness of human dignity and this preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. This really strikes to those two passages in particular. And you can see there are just a few paragraphs that address this in Centesimus Annus and in Laudato Si. And if you're interested, Gustavo Gutierrez is credited with kind of being the grandfather of liberation theology. And he distills basically his life's work into this 9-page article in Theological Studies called The Option for the Poor Arises from Faith in Christ. And it is just superb. I'll put the document in the chat it looks like I can't. I'm not allowed to send you a document. But if you Google that title, The Option for the Poor Arises from Faith in Christ, you'll be able to find it. And it cut me off there. But if you Google that title, the PDF is available on the internet, and it's just beautiful. It's clear, and it's everything Gustavo's been trying to say. And he even draws from his friend Benedict XVI in making the argument for the preferential option for the poor. Wow. And then in 2019, Bishop Mark Seitz from El Paso wrote a really stunning pastoral letter called Night Will Be No More in response to the shooting in El Paso that was targeting members of the Hispanic community, including Latinx immigrants. And it's a really powerful witness to, I think, the way in which these principles that we've been studying really point us to the need for another principle in Catholic social teaching, focusing especially on racial justice. And that's where I'd like to end our time next time, is trying to make that connection between the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, a term coined by Pedro Rupe in 1968, and the need for us to roll up our sleeves and get to work for racial justice as part of that preferential option for the poor in 2022. All right, so yes, Maria.
Yeah, just before we finish tonight, I did give you a big task with Catholic social teaching, but you're doing a great job, and everybody really loves the class. You're getting kudos all over. So no matter what, it's more than we had, and it is a springboard for moving forward. So thank you on behalf of all of us, and we're looking forward to the rest of the class. Thanks, Marcus.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Maria.
You're
Wonderful.
welcome.